So I'm just going to start reading a little section, which actually in a way introduces Uncle Charles. So is it okay if I stand up? I'm afraid that I'm not loud enough. Is that okay, Craig? So this is an excerpt from a book when I was talking about my high school questions, and I was asking, is the church true? Are its teachings correct? So to my high school self, these questions were important and also terrifying, because the validity of so many other things seemed to hinge on these questions. I knew I'd have to figure this out, but at the same time I didn't want to. I feared there was a zero-sum contest between my religious truth and everyone else's truth. What if the church lost? And then what could I believe and who would I be? For help, I turned to my crazy Uncle Charles, as he called himself, my dad's little brother, a Stanford and Harvard-educated professor of Japanese literature at Tufts University. I told him my doubts about Latter-day Saint claims. I wrote very long emails. He called them Melissa's Maramails. Asking these questions: what about evolution? What about blacks in the priesthood? What about polygamy? What about Joseph Smith saying there were 5-foot-high Quakers living on the moon? Uncle Charles replied that long ago when he was an undergraduate, he too had had doubts. He had gone to another Latter-day Saint professor for help. This professor had said, there are a lot of stories in the world, but Mormonism is the story that I want to be true. Uncle Charles concluded his message to me with the statement, there are a lot of stories in the world, but the Mormon story is the one I want to be true. To the extent that it is not, I will make it true. Now, at the time, I read this as a sort of well-meaning self-deception, kind of like the Santa Claus story. Santa Claus doesn't really exist, but for kids who believe in Santa Claus, he does. Wow! He flies around the sky in a sleigh drawn by reindeer. He fits down the chimney and magically leaves presents with tags signed in parents' handwriting. That's great for, say, 5-year-olds. But for everyone else, and for those 5-year-olds whose parents have let them in on the secret, it's just another tender falsehood. So to say something like, to the extent that it is not, I will make it true, sounded foolish and also a little arrogant. You can't make a religion true in the same way that you can pull off the Santa Claus Act. There had to be a right answer that was definitely and completely right. Despite this ambivalence, I was ultimately comforted by Uncle Charles's endorsement, incomplete as it seemed at the time. Maybe there were some things about religion that weren't clear to me at the moment, but Uncle Charles was pretty smart. And here I'm pausing from the book and to say that the last thing about introducing Uncle Charles is probably the reason why I'm a Latter-day Saint today is because Uncle Charles helped me see a way to be a Latter-day Saint, having the questions that I had and thinking the thoughts that I did. I trusted him. And then because I trusted him, I kept on looking. Thanks, Uncle Charles. So later on, I did a PhD. I researched Asian religions and lots of histories of religions. And I didn't see anything exceptionally problematic about the Latter-day Saint tradition. Although I knew that many in my church have been terribly disillusioned by historic or contemporary blemishes in the church's institutional structures and people. I found big problems in all the world's traditions and theologies and histories and all of those things that I studied everywhere. But with regard to these things that trouble people about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, some might say, Joseph Smith lied to his rank-and-file followers, and most importantly to his wife Emma about his practice of polygamy. Therefore, he wasn't a prophet, and therefore the religion that he founded is all bogus. Or others might say, the church's structure is patriarchal, and patriarchy is oppressive to women. Therefore, the patriarchs are not called of God, and the church is all bogus. There was a time in my life when I would have thought about religion in the same uncompromisingly syllogistic way, as if a religious system were a stream of cheap Christmas tree lights. If one light broke, the whole string was out. And that's how I felt when, as a high school student, I asked Uncle Charles, is the church true? Are his teachings correct? In my mind, just one flaw, such as a teaching attributed to Joseph Smith, the moon was inhabited by short people dressed like Quakers, could set off the whole chain reaction that ended up with my faith being bogus. To me at the time, Uncle Charles's response was small comfort. To the extent that the church is not true, I will make it true. If something is bogus, I thought, how can you do anything to make it true? This faith-unraveling syllogism, that is, Joseph Smith was a fraud, therefore the religion he founded is bogus, therefore one's entire faith as a Latter-day Saint is bogus, is actually just the reverse of a faith-promoting syllogism often circulated at church on Sunday. If the Book of Mormon is true, the syllogism goes, then everything Joseph Smith did or said was divinely inspired. If Joseph Smith was divinely inspired in everything, then everything about the church is just how God wants it. I now have a different perspective on this issue of religious claims. Both Christmas tree light syllogisms, the faith unraveling and the faith promoting, are flawed. They demand that light leap from one point to another along a single string of connections. They argue if one junction along the string is flawed, then the whole string is dysfunctional, or if the whole string is functional, then every single junction must be perfect. But instead of a string of Christmas tree lights, perhaps a better metaphor for I see the church now is a sourdough starter, which I sometimes use to bake our family's bread. Artisan sourdough with a reddish golden crust that crackles and a creamy interior with large irregular holes and complex flavors doesn't just happen. Enzymes break apart large tasteless starch molecules so wild yeast can unlock sugars and create bubbles of carbon dioxide that stretch strands of gluten. And strains of bacteria are also fighting in the starter for dominance, and they create this acidic environment. So all of this is a process of fermentation, what we usually call food going bad. It begins with the starter, a colony of wild yeast and bacteria in a starchy soup. There's nothing pure about sourdough starter. It's stinky, it smells a little off, but when you introduce it into a properly balanced supply of flour, water, and salt, the starter is a catalyst for producing a complex set of interactions that make heavenly bread. Religious traditions are like artisan sourdough. They're complex, living things, both organization and organism, created and sustained by many processes and actors, shaped by time and their environment. They can be naturally subject to corruption, and yet they are also susceptible through the same process of leavening to producing goodness. Doctrinal teaching is important, but I don't think any story we try to tell about God can be complete as a truth in itself. To me, the way truths become manifest in lived experience is a more valid measure of what is real or divine. Who cares about whether something is true by any abstract measure, including intellectual and theological argument, if it cannot be realized in our daily work, our bodies, or most importantly, relationships with fellow beings? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said that what people did was more important than what people said, and that people could be known by their fruits. So maybe when Uncle Charles said, "I will make it true," he was simply making the effort required to exercise faith, to swim within the starchy soup, and let natural processes work over time. Perhaps he was also speaking of Latter-day Saints' responsibility to exercise initiative in addition to faith, to do our part to bring our culture and everyday practices into harmony with our highest beliefs and values, to doggedly keep our covenants to follow Christ and be known as his people.